um, taken a lot of time and effort to make this really a valuable experience for all of us who have gathered here today. So I will begin with a short prayer. Gracious God, who is always ready to give us comfort, who is always ready to embrace with us with love, may our hearts be open to learn, to grow, not only for ourselves, but for others that we may encounter, that we may share this gift of silence prayer with others and see the fruit of your Spirit evident in our lives and in our world. Bless this time, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, John. Let's see if I can share my slideshow here. And I'm specifically not putting it in present mode because I have a couple of videos and I can't get out of the videos easily. So I'm leaving it in this mode. So apologize for that. We already had an introduction and a prayer. Rather than a sit, we'll do a sit the second half after we've learned a little bit more about trauma. But I would like to start out with a visualization. That's a grounding visualization. And so I ask people to start by taking 3 long, deep breaths. And as you do that, if you feel comfortable, feel free to close your eyes or cast your gaze downward. And I want you to think about the space that you generally do centering prayer in. And think of an object in that space that has positive meaning for you. Might be a picture, might be a gift, might be an icon, might be something, might be some rocks you picked up at the beach or some shells. But just think of something that has positive meaning for you in the space you usually do centering prayer. And as you think about that object, and just notice where in your body you feel those positive feelings. Then spend a little time thinking about colors of that object or the textures it has. Think about what it'd feel like if you held it in your hands. Think if there's any taste or smell or sound that is associated with it. Think of the meaning it has. And as you think about those things, notice if that positive feeling has grown in your body even a little bit. And just know that if you're ever feeling overwhelmed during a sit, that it's always okay to open your eyes and look at that object and feel this positive feeling. And now when you're ready, please come back and join us and open your eyes. I wanted to start out with some learning goals. My hope is that by doing this, you'll have a better understanding of trauma and how centering prayer and other meditative practices can help in healing trauma and where they can be re-traumatizing. That we gain in our knowledge and skill in leading centering prayer retreats and groups so that they're less likely to re-traumatize. And thirdly, to be able to recognize when somebody may be becoming re-traumatized and have strategies to help to cope and heal. The fourth one I would add is, I don't know, when I present things, I always use stories because I think that's what people remember the most. And so I'm going to be telling some stories, and some of them involve trauma. Actually, most of them do. It's a trauma presentation. So make sure you're taking care of yourself. And if you need to, do whatever you need to. If you need to take a break, process with somebody afterward, just notice, pay attention to yourself, and take care of yourself. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here. Really, since my college years, I've practiced some time of quiet prayer. Started with Be Still and Know That I Am God in college. Then it moved to centering prayer about just over 30 years ago. I became familiar with centering prayer and Thomas Keating. And what was interesting when I'm thinking about trauma is about 18 years ago, I had a chance to be with my father when he died. And there was about 3-4 months after that where I was not able to enter into centering or other types of quiet prayer, even though I'd practiced them for virtually my whole adult life up to that point. And the thing to know about that when I reflect on it is dad died of COPD. He was a carpenter, and whether it was, the asbestos or the silicon from the uh, powdered cement or something else. I mean, he was doing it before they even knew what masks were. But the last few weeks, he was struggling for every breath. And even that last evening, he had some panic around breathing. And when I think about my quiet prayer, I've always used my breath to enter into centering or other types of meditation. And looking back, it makes perfect sense why using my breath didn't work, because that was putting me right back at his bedside at his death. But I did have his rosary. And even though I grew up Catholic, I was never a big rosary guy. And so I spent that time where I wasn't able to do my sits, and I used his rosary and prayed the rosary and learned those prayers. And now I often will say a rosary when I'm going to sleep. And I often don't finish them, but I've been assured that the angels finish them when I don't. So I'm pretty good at beginning, and I think the angels are pretty good at completing it for me. But I want you to know about that about me, because I'm going to come back to that. I worked as a social worker for about 35 years, retired about 3 years ago. And the last 21 of those years was working in school systems, the Robbinsdale school system, and mostly I worked with grade school students. And I worked with a lot of students who we labeled EBD, emotional behavior disordered, a lot of students with trauma, a lot of students with significant mental health issues, and a lot of them were in center-based classrooms. So these are the students, because of their behavior, weren't able to function in a gen ed classroom, and so I was in the grade school where we had several 2 to 4 rooms at any given year for students who really had a lot of trauma. And while teachers always felt like it took forever to get students into those situations, into the center-based rooms, the idea was that they would learn the skills and move back into the gen ed. The reality was it never happened. And so my interest was always not just following the IEP goals, but what could make a difference to allow these students to gain the skills and to gain what they needed so they could really be successful at school. And back when I went to school 100 years ago, trauma was not even a topic out there. But I was going to continuing education and other things, and working with the school psychologist and our school like mental health therapist, learned a lot more about trauma. And I kept hearing that yoga was a helpful thing. So I bought a book on yoga and realized pretty quickly you can't learn yoga from a book. But then I went and got training in something called Yoga Calm. It was developed out west in Oregon, and there was a lady here in the Twin Cities, who was teaching it, and I became a certified Yoga Calm teacher. And it really involved simple yoga poses, community building, but all the lessons ended in a short meditation, really a visualization. I was starting to use that in classrooms and finding some success. I remember the second year I was using it, there was a fire drill, and I went out by where the EBD students were, because they usually needed extra support there. And the student who usually would have been the ringleader in causing problems was challenging the other students to see who could do tree pose the longest. And I thought, oh, maybe this is making a difference here. But I also had this sense that there were certain students who had a lot of trauma who didn't seem to be able to access. And when I read the stuff about yoga and meditation, they all said, be careful with body scans and be careful with meditation, go slow. But nobody said what that looked like. And then on my second or third year working with this with students with the yoga calm stuff and with the visualizations and the meditation piece, I started in a kindergarten, first grade classroom for students, for EBD students. And it was my first lesson with them, and they were attentive through the movement piece and the teaching piece. And we got to the visualization, and I think it was a visualization of stepping into calmness. And I always had on the smart board some nature scenes that students could look at if they were getting overwhelmed by things, and some sound. But when I started it, one of the paraprofessionals turned off the lights. And I remember thinking to myself, I got to tell her not to turn off the lights, because I don't want it dark, I want people to feel safe. Well, when she turned the lights on about 3 minutes later, two of the kindergartners just had tears running down their face. And I knew I tapped into some trauma. I knew they both had a lot of trauma. And we checked in with them both. They're together, and then later, and they all said, "Oh, they're fine, they're fine." But I knew I tapped into some trauma, and so I didn't do the meditation part. I did the other parts, but I didn't do the meditation parts. But I was bothered by, well, what do I do with that? Then I ran into a book by David Treleaven called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, and it just opened the door for me in how to be more trauma sensitive in my work with doing meditation and doing centering prayer. David himself I believe, was working with people, if I'm remembering right, who were chemically dependent and had some secondary trauma from that. And he went to his meditation practice that he had, and it made his symptoms worse. And so he did a research. So he's looking to see, well, what can you do with that? And he couldn't find anything. As he was looking, people started reaching out to him, and he ended up becoming the expert. And so he gives some real specific things about when trauma comes up, when doing meditation, what you can do with that. And so the second part of the presentation, I'll be talking a lot about his work. Let's see. And I think so. We need to move on next to what is trauma. And I like the definition that Resume makes in My Grandmother's Hands. Trauma is not an event, but what happens in the body. It's not a flaw, but a highly effective tool to keep us safe, the body's protective response to an event or a series of events. So it's not the event, it's the body's response to the event. You can have a trauma response to anything we perceive or our bodies perceive as a threat. And it's never a personal failing, never something you can choose. It's always something that happens to us. And the part I would add to it is that oftentimes it's shaming. People who have been in combat situations, maybe can never forgive themselves for some of the things they've done. People who have been raped often blame themselves. When you think of domestic situations where the people who should be keeping you safe and supporting you are being violent towards you, just all kinds of shame and blame goes on with those situations. And then the problem is then when you move to when it happens during something like centering prayer, then it feels like not only am I flawed because I experienced this trauma, but now I'm flawed because I can't even pray. Also, let's talk for a minute about trauma and as oppression. We used to talk when I was first learning about trauma. We used to talk about big traumas and small traumas, and the big traumas were things like being in combat, being raped, having a bridge collapse on you, whatever, and the small traumas with all the other little things. But interesting, what they found is people who are dealing with what they call microaggressions or little things that happen all the time to people of color, or to somebody who's biracial, or for a woman who's working in a man's world with sexism. They looked and acted and just the big traumas. And so now we don't talk about small and big traumas. We just talk about trauma because how it takes place in our body and working through that is the same, really. And then there's secondary trauma, as I mentioned. One of the authors that's where his work came from, was having his own secondary trauma. To give you another example of that, my last year working as a school social worker, last few years, I was on the crisis team. So we'd be called out to a school where something happened where they needed extra support. And I had two calls my last year in the spring where I had the opportunity to go out and be supportive that involved guns. The first one involved going in with the teacher I knew and talking to her third grade classroom about how one of their classmates was shot over the weekend. And I'll never forget the look on their faces that went from their normal just goofing around to disbelief and shock to anger and just all the emotions across the board. And about 10 days later, when that student died, I still feel a little guilty that I wasn't able to be there to help them continue to process. But I was getting some cancer treatment that day and I couldn't be there. But there was that piece that I just felt the need for some closure with those students. And another one involved supporting a middle school where a student had brought a handgun to school and shot through the ceiling. And I was there afterwards, and they had canceled school for a couple of days. and there were several of us social workers and psychologists from other buildings to help support that building. And they had the morning meeting with the teachers, and the teachers were going to go online with their homerooms that morning. And I still remember the teacher came up to me with just tears in her face as she walked up to the group of us, and I went over to her and put my hand on her shoulder, and she was just shaking. And she had to go talk to her class. And the person who had brought the gun to school was in her homeroom, and she was wondering what she missed. But so those things kind of live in us. And I realized how much I was traumatized by those a couple of weeks, months after I retired, when I was meeting with a group of friends. We were planning a Boundary Waters trip, and this is mostly high school friends. And one of my friends showed me his phone that had a picture of a handgun in it on it, that he was proud that he got this new handgun. And I kind of went off on him, and I realized, okay, I need to do something to make this relationship right. But secondary trauma is also real. If you're in the helping profession, it's something to be very aware of. Um, so it's a few more things about trauma. There's a George Bona in his book, The End of Trauma. He's done a lot of research on things like after 9/11, how people responded. So they did a survey of people like a week or two after 9/11 who were directly affected, and like 3 months later. And what they found was most people experiencing a traumatic event don't develop PTSD, right? About 70% had at least one symptom of PTSD at the first week after, but most didn't develop it, but some did. And I also want to talk about how everybody's affected differently. Give you a couple examples. Since retiring, I've started working with the Red Cross as a volunteer crisis counselor, and the Red Cross has what they call they put together a team when somebody dies in a disaster to help support the family members that are left. And so I've been a part of a few of those teams. And I still remember talking to an individual, my second phone call with them. Most of it's done over the phone. And he was saying, I think I'm doing okay. And he'd lost a family member in a fire that they both lived there. And I said, how are you going to know? He says, well, I'm sleeping okay, I'm eating okay, and I'm going to meet with a couple of friends, take a walk around the lake, and tell them how I'm doing. And if they think I need counseling, I'm going to buy myself a counselor. If they don't, I won't. So even though that should be a situation where you would develop trauma, he really wasn't traumatized. Then I'll compare that with another situation where we had a multi-family fire or multi-apartment fire. I don't know if it was 30 or 40 units that were displaced. And though I ended up working with one person on a regular basis until they got into therapy. And they were the only person in that apartment complex. Nobody died. They lost some things, but he was the only person that had renter's insurance. So he had the most resources. He had an apartment or a hotel room until he could get into a new apartment. His stuff was going to be covered, but he was so affected by this fire that he needed that support. So again, we're all affected differently. Another part just to be aware of is trauma caused by people is generally harder to recover from than that caused by natural disasters. Think of if a tornado hits a school and some kids die, it's awful. But if a school shooter goes in and shoots a bunch of kids, it takes a whole nother level of awfulness. Um, Again, I mentioned domestic situations, the very people that should be keeping you safe when they're the ones who are doing the harm. Really hard to recover from some of those things. And we know it's more prevalent in certain communities. We know where there's greater poverty, there's more violence. This has been shown out in study after study, and where there's more violence, there's going to be more trauma response. We know there's greater violence in BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. In the GLBTQ communities, there's more violence towards women, more violence towards persons with disabilities. So the thing to think about is if I'm working with people in the prison or if I'm working with street people, there's probably a lot more trauma response in those communities than there are in the general population. So just some things to think about. So I'm going to move now I want to talk a little bit about how trauma happens. And there's this thing called a fight, flight, and freeze response. And we're going to see if this video will play so we can hear it, so we can get a better understanding of that. First, I'm going to turn up my volume because she talks pretty soft.
Have you ever wondered, why do my hands get all cold and sweaty when I'm nervous? Or why does my stomach get all tight when I'm talking to my boss? Well, today we're going to talk about our body and brain's natural reaction to danger. It's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, our bodies have developed this amazing reaction to help keep us safe. For thousands of years, humans' biggest challenge was survival. They had to worry about wild animals and heights, warring tribes, and other dangers. So the body developed this instinctual way to keep us safe. Now, unfortunately, in current day, we don't have nearly as many of these real and immediate dangers. So a lot of times this reaction just makes us uncomfortable. When faced with a real and immediate danger, like a tiger, our instincts take over. We have three main reactions: fight, run away, or freeze. Now, these come naturally. We don't have to think about it. These reactions actually turn off the thinking part of our brain. It's kind of like in Star Trek when the captain says, "All power to shields," and they lower the lights on the bridge. Yes, I am a nerd. Now, the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's the part that does thinking, words, planning, that all gets mostly shut down. And the back part of our brain, which is reactive and instinctive, gets amped up. This can be really helpful if you're facing a tiger, because if you're facing a tiger and you take time to plan out what your next move is, you're most likely to be eaten. However, this is not helpful if your perceived danger is a public speech and the front part of your brain turns off, or you're asking out a date and all of a sudden you can't make words come out of your mouth. That's when it becomes a real pain. Our body does other things to try and keep us safe. It sends extra blood to the big muscles, which takes the blood flow away from our extremities, like our hands and feet. So that's where the phrase cold feet comes from. It makes us start to sweat, so our hands will often get cold and sweaty, or cold and clammy. It turns on the adrenaline glands. Those start pumping out. This gives us energy for a quick burst to either run away or punch someone. But later on, that adrenaline gives us the shakes. It turns off our digestive system because we don't really need to be digesting that hamburger when we're running away from a tiger. However, when our digestive system turns off, that can cause all sorts of problems. A decreased appetite, a tight feeling in the stomach, dry mouth, and even people could get the runs or wet their pants. Obviously, these are all outcomes that we don't really want. The fight, flight, freeze response also tightens the muscles. It heightens some senses, like vision gets pinpointed, creating tunnel vision. Our breathing rate gets shorter and shallower, so we're breathing faster but not deeper, and our heart rate goes up. The fight, flight, freeze response also temporarily turns off the immune system. Now, that's also a good thing because, again, it's all power to shields. We're putting all power to keeping ourselves alive. But if the fight, flight, freeze response is turned on all the time, then our immune system is turned off much of the time. And that's why people who are always stressed out are often getting sick. Now, with the freeze response, we sometimes see a few different things than the fight or flight response. More frequently, we'll see people feeling numb, people shrinking, hiding, or complying, just going along with what the person or the thing in power seems to be wanting. Now, this response, this fight, flight, freeze response, is really helpful, could be helpful in situations where there's real and immediate danger, and it's meant to work in short bursts. The problem that happens is when we are constantly having this reaction to things that aren't real dangers. They're just perceived threats, like a boss asking to talk with us or a public speaking event. When we are constantly in the fight, flight, freeze response, then our body gets trapped in this elevated state for a long period of time. This leads to exhaustion, insomnia, muscle tension, digestive problems, and frequent illnesses. In an upcoming video, we are going to teach you how to train your mind and body.
Okay. I'm going to skip the brain parts. I don't know if you guys can see me, but uh, she did a nice job of talking about the fight and flight, not as much about the freeze. I want to talk a little bit about that. And all that fight, flight, and freeze, that's all what's called the sympathetic nervous system. It's to keep us safe. And what I talk about is actually, maybe I'll skip the share here so I can talk to you guys in person. Let's see if I can. Where'd you all go? Can you see me now?
You're
Am I the biggest one on the screen?
you're still sharing. Do you see a red stop share button?
Stop share. Okay. There you go. Now can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want you to imagine you can take your hand like this is model of the brain. If you put your thumb in the center and then put your fingers down and do the same on the other side and put it together, that's a model of your brain, right? And so this part here would be your thumb would be, or the lower part of your thumb would be considered your brainstem. And sometimes that's called like the reptilian brain. And that controls things like breathing when you don't think about it, heart rate, those kinds of basic things. And then your thumb is, I like to call it the watchdog. The amygdala is a piece that's kind of the control center. Um, but when I'm talking to kids, I talk about that's its job is to always watch for danger, right? And it kicks in before our thinking brain. So our prefrontal cortex would be up here by the top, right? And so back up a second. So the watchdog or the lower part of the brain, that's what all mammals have. The thinking brain is what makes us human, right? That's where logic is. That's where compassion is. That's where we are when we're meditating, right? Hopefully. The problem is when this watchdog gets carried away, right? When we get that fight, flight, or freeze response. I'm going to talk about the difference between the two. Fight and flight, it's the same limbic system, but it works differently. When fight and flight, the blood goes to the muscles, like she said. The heart rate beats faster, our blood pressure goes up, our vision gets more focused. With freeze response, it happens a little differently. What happens with freeze is the blood leaves our big muscles and goes to our core. So if we get cut, we're not going to bleed out. Um, our heart rate drops, our blood pressure drops. Sometimes we'll faint. Think of a possum when a possum freezes, right? Or a mouse when it's in the mouth of a cat. That's a freeze response. Um, and somebody who's in a freeze response, that's kind of related to disassociation or kind of what can happen to us when we're having a trauma response when we try to meditate. So I just wanted to make sure I'm explaining those. And I want to tell you about two stories. Um, Probably the only fun story I get to tell you today. We're talking about trauma, and then another story. So one that doesn't lead to trauma and one that does. When I was working, when it was nice, I used to try to bike once a week to school. It was about an hour bike. And one spring morning, I suppose it was in April, I left about 6:30, and not far from my house, I have a little place where I go over a little bridge over a creek, and then there's a small path that's at the time was buckthorn line, so it was a windy path, and you didn't want to go off the path because you were going to get all cut up. And as I came around the corner, and I was probably going too fast, I had like three instantaneous thoughts. The first was, cool, three turkeys. The second is that Tom or that male's coming after me. The third was it's him or me. And I immediately stepped on the pedals and got going as fast as I could because I knew I couldn't stop. And I screamed as loud as I could. And, it was that fight, flight, and freeze. It was like my body just took over. And I remember, pulling back onto the small lane and I biked the rest of the way to school. So I had about a 45-minute bike. And when I got there, I talked to a couple of my colleagues, and talked to Will was especially helpful because he asked, did it come up with its spikes? This is, what do you mean it spikes? Well, turkeys on their talons, they have a quarter to a half-inch spikes on the bottom of their feet. It helps them stand in the trees. But when they fight, they come up with those spikes and they'll go at your face. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe, after I got through the turkeys, I went between feeling silly for being so upset to looking behind me to see if they were following me, right? But when talking to Will made me realize two things. First of all, that maybe it really was a dangerous situation that my body picked up, that my brain really wasn't active. But then I realized that from the moment I says that you or me, I had no memory of biking that next block. And my mind must have still been working because it was a curvy path, and I made it through that curvy path. And I got to that street on the other side, okay. But I had no memory, which, she talked about in the video, that the memories get messed up when we're in that fight, flight, and freeze. Now, I'm going to tell you another story about a person from Treleaven's book. I'm going to call him, we'll call him Bill. Bill was a photographer, and he was working with some dancers, wanted some pictures taken. And so he had gotten this space And they were doing their dances, and he was taking the pictures, and he was really into his art. Everything was flowing, and he was getting into taking the pictures and getting what he needed. And all of a sudden, all the dancers stopped, and they're looking behind him. And he says he turned around, and there were three guys, one of them with a gun pointed at him. And he heard one of the dancers say, "Just do what they say." And they said, and he wanted to fight or fly, right? He wanted to fight or run away, but they had a gun at him. So they said, "Well, come with us." And so he went with them, and they took him out into the alley, and they pushed him around and took his wallet and his camera and left. And um, he ended up back in his apartment with the door. And he went back afterwards, and he was in his apartment either with his door locked or walking the streets looking for the guys. Um, he tried to go back to a meditation practice that he always found calming, but as he did that meditation practice, all these symptoms of not being able to sleep and being upset all got worse, and didn't want to talk to people. He was disengaged. So he had a trauma response, a pretty significant one, and he ended up talking to David Treleaven as a therapist. And at one point, David asked him to notice where he was feeling the trauma in one of their sessions, and he says, "My legs," and which made perfect sense to David because he says, "Well, that's where the blood was wanting you to run, but you kind of got stuck there. You couldn't run." So unlike me, where I had something I could do, I could pedal. He couldn't. He was frozen because of that gun in his face. And unlike me, who went and talked to people and processed that and worked through that, he wasn't talking to anybody, and so he got stuck there. So one of the theories about how trauma develops is when we have a traumatic experience and that gets stuck somehow, that's when the trauma happens, and that is located in the body, not so much necessarily the mind. And that's why they say be careful with body scans, because if you're scanning the body, and we did a little bit of that when I had you notice where you felt good about an object in your room and where you felt that goodness in your body. But when we do body scans, that can activate that trauma. And also with meditation, because again, for most people, meditation can be a really helpful piece. For some people that develops trauma, we don't necessarily know why. But I just wanted to be able to show you my hands to talk about that, and I'm going to try to share this thing again. So what we're going to do now is let's see, I think I talked about all that. Yeah. And one of the things they talk about I'll just add a couple things here. One of the things they'll talk about is that trauma that doesn't get integrated or metabolized, there's another word for that. That's when it ends up being a trauma that lives in the body, and a trauma that can then haunt us like later in life or at a later period. Next, we're going to split into small groups, and I have a real specific thing I want you to do. So one person from each group, just type in a couple of the things that are fruits of centering prayer. And the most important part is that we had a chance to talk about that, because in a minute, we're just going to look at what happens when somebody's traumatized. And if that's happening instead of these fruits, then we need to be doing something else. So I'm seeing bonding, connection, desire to ask what's mine, safe haven with God, the sweet place, more grounded, being in your body, more present, helps me myself to ground, wholeness, integration, trust in the slow work of God, community building, trust, fruit for daily life, healing, unloading of subconscious, wonderful, wonderful things, less anxious. But take a minute to look what's on there if you can read some of it. I'm seeing wholeness, integration, trust in the slow work of God.
Yes,
Yeah,
but
lots of
please
wonderful
read them
stuff.
because they're too small for us to see.
Yeah. And maybe what I'll do is, maybe we can try to see if we can put these together. But I'm going to close this for now. Here are the symptoms of traumatic stress disorder. I adapted these from the DSM-5. That's a diagnostic statistical manual, what therapists use to diagnose people. And traumatic stress would be what people experience right away. Post-traumatic stress would be if a lot of this stuff is around in a couple months. But I've adapted it and changed it so it's more understandable. So if somebody's feeling irritable or angry outbursts, if they're being hypervigilant, always checking for a safe environment, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbance, or recurrent distressing dreams, intrusive distressing thoughts, intense distress when reminders of an event, efforts to avoid memories of an event. And the last three are associated more with that freeze response, inability to experience positive emotions, feeling dazed, time slowed down, time altered, altered perceptions, inability to remember an important part of a traumatic event. So if somebody starts a meditative practice or returns to meditative practice or centering prayer, and they're having these kind of symptoms versus what we were just talking about and sharing some on the whiteboard, then we need to do something else because it's not working for them. The other piece we talked about is there's typically a lot of shame when there's trauma. And then there's an additional shame about not being able to pray. And so I think one of the things that's important is we let people know that sometimes this can happen and to please share it with us when it does happen, because I think what usually happens is people just leave and never come back. Other part I wanted to talk about is sometimes we have uncomfortable feelings that isn't a trauma, right? So if I've had angry words with somebody the day before and now I'm sitting in centering prayer and that conversation comes up, that's not about a trauma response. That's my conscience telling me that I need to work out that relationship. And I do the best I can to go back to my sacred word and try to spend the time right after the bell rings to think about how I'm going to make that relationship right. Sometimes I can do that. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I'm right there trying to figure out what I'm going to do, right? That's not a trauma response. People have dark night experiences. It's not uncommon for people, especially early on in starting centering prayer, to have consolations, really good feelings like God's there with you and directing you. And then after a bit, sometimes those disappear and people feel like God's abandoning them. Well, that's not a trauma. That's not a trauma. That's a dark night experience. And talking with a centering prayer group member or a spiritual director can be really helpful in those situations. Sometimes in centering prayer, I've experienced we're called to do something we don't feel comfortable with. That's not comfortable, right? About 6-7 years ago, I felt these whispers about needing to share centering prayer and quiet prayer with other people. And I really wasn't excited about that. And here I am talking to all of you. That's not always, so sometimes it's not. So I think it's important to distinguish uncomfortable feelings from a trauma response. Let's go here to the next slide. So let's talk about brain and meditation a little bit. So there's a lot of research that's starting to suggest that mindfulness and meditation have all kinds of health benefits, right? They've done brain scans and they find there's more gray matter in the areas of self-regulation and less gray matter in the amygdala in meditators. So the amygdala is like the control center for the fight, flight, and freeze response. And, so that tells us that people that meditate don't have an overdeveloped flight, flight, and freeze response. It helps lessen that. There's been research around dealing with physical pain. I found this one fascinating. I read this a couple of years ago. They did a study where they had a plate that they would put in people's hands that would cause pain. It would heat and cause pain. It wouldn't burn them, but it caused pain. And so they'd hook them up to this way that they could monitor the brain waves. And this thing would heat up and they would feel the pain. And then they would let them know, okay, now we're going to have a buzzer. And 30 seconds later, it's going to heat up again. And for the people that weren't meditators, when that bell went off, they had a pain response. When the thing heated up, they had a pain response. And afterwards, they had a pain response. The people who were regular meditators, when the bell went off, had no pain response. When the thing heated up, they had a pain response. Afterwards, they didn't have any pain response. My wife is a retired occupational therapist and chaplain, and she always talks about how pain is in the body and suffering's in the mind. Meditation can help us deal with physical pain. Regular meditations associated with better self-regulation, enhanced memory, clearer thinking, greater ability to deal with stress, quicker recovery from anger, reduced high blood pressure, decrease inflammation, on and on, right? So there's a ton of benefits to meditation. Most of that hasn't been done with centering prayer, but centering prayer is so close to these other types of meditation that I think all those health benefits are likely there. But we're not doing it for that. We're doing it to invite God's presence and action in our lives. So I want to talk about James Gordon here a minute, and I want to thank Nelson, who reminded me of James Gordon. I'd read some of his stuff earlier, but went back to some of his stuff. And James Gordon is a person who's done worked in with groups of people who've experienced trauma. He's done that on the Gaza Strip. He's done that in Sudan. He's done that after school shootings. He did that after 9/11. And so he's working with people, helping them heal their trauma. And these things I pulled from his book, The Transformation. And he says that meditation reverses the biological damage that trauma causes. It calms the fight, flight, and freeze response. Meditation frees us and brings us into the present moment, right? And when we're in the present moment, then we're not stuck in the fear and the anger caused by trauma. Regular meditation tones what they call our vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve helps in things like self-regulation, enhanced memory, clearer thinking, greater ability to deal with life stresses. And he notes in some research that repeatedly shown that meditation actually promotes growth in new brain tissue in areas of the frontal cortex that trauma often damages. And they talk about how some of these benefits happen after an intense 8-week course. So it's not just for monks who meditated all their lives who receive the benefits, but even doing it as little as 8 weeks can make a difference. And he gives these cautions. And I'll come to some other ones and after a little later. But he talks about cautions for meditation and other mind-body practices. He talks about sometimes doing meditation opens us up to long suppressed, disturbing thoughts and feelings. Most often, he says, you'll be able to relax with them and let them come and go. There's that piece when we're meditating where we can kind of separate ourselves from from our feelings and our thoughts and be curious about them. If we can do that, then we're probably good. If, however, we get overwhelmed by those feelings, he suggested opening your eyes, practice another day, practice for a shorter period. And if that keeps happening, you might want to contact a therapist. Or you could also try some other mindfulness practices. The other thing he suggests, and which was interesting, is when starting or increasing meditation or other mind-body practices, you might need to change your medications for things like blood pressure, depression, anxiety, insomnia, pain, etc. I had my own experience when I retired 3 years ago. I had more time, and so I was meditating, doing centering prayer a couple times a day, and I was working out on a regular basis. And I found myself getting faint after my workouts. And I came home one day after almost falling over after a workout and took my blood pressure, and it was way low. I had to cut my blood pressure medication in half once I started meditating more. Of course, I left a stressful job, which also probably had something to do with it. But just some things to think about. So let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll see people back at 2:20. Looking around. Oop. This person was always looking around to see who was this, for the color of the jacket of the person who persecuted him in school when he was in high school. Even though he was in another state, he wasn't sleeping well. And so what he did, he went back to his meditation practice that had been calming for him before, and that just escalated everything, and the symptoms got a lot worse. And so he ended up working with a therapist, and one of the things he found was just by pushing on his legs, that was enough to bring him back, to be in the window of tolerance, to be in the present moment, so he could stick with his meditation. And part of that's recognizing when we need to apply the brakes. If we're totally overwhelmed during a sit, then maybe it's time to put on the brakes for a minute and try something different. And I think as leaders, we need to stay in the window of tolerance. One of the things I appreciate about at least Minnesota Contemplative Outreach is everything I've been to, whether it's an introduction to centering prayer or a retreat or a longer retreat, there's always 2 facilitators. And the chance of one person having some crisis, so they're out of the window of tolerance, might happen, but the chance of 2 people is pretty slim. So at least there's one person there who's in the window of tolerance. So just some things to think about with that. And then he talks about shifting attention to support stability. And this is really about those grounding practices. We tried one right at the beginning where we notice something that gives us positive feeling in the place where we meditate or do our centering prayer. Our sacred word is an anchor for centering, for being in the present moment. One thing to think about is when you're sacred word no longer brings you back to the present moment. Maybe it's time to try something different. He talks about reorienting attention. And again, that might be, I put the candle on during our sit, if somebody is overwhelmed, they can open their eyes and look at the candle. That's reorienting your attention. I'm attending to the environment, looking outside the window and just noticing what's out there. I had a good therapist friend who did a lot of therapy with people towards the end of her career over the phone. And she would deal with a lot of people with anxiety and sometimes panic attacks. And she would have them look at a wall hanging or something at the wall and explain all the details in it, because that helped them be in the present moment. When they were there, then they weren't feeling so much anxiety. And focus on resilience. So where has this person done well? And most of us have resilience. We aren't always aware of it. And utilize the breath. And in the exercises I'm showing today, I've kind of stayed away from the breath a little bit with grounding, just because of my own experience with my dad's death. But there's a lot of grounding experience practices that if you just put out grounding experience in YouTube or on different apps for things like what's it called? Insight Timer, they'll come up with ones that use the breath as well. So we're just going to watch a video. We're going to skip this one just in the sake of time. And I'm going to show you this one. There's another grounding type of exercise. And you can hear that, Rainey?
Yes.
The 5, 4,
Perfect.
3, 2, 1 method is a grounding exercise that can help you stay in the moment and avoid negative thinking and worry. You can do this exercise anywhere, at home, at school, in the car, or even in the middle of a crowd. You can do it sitting, standing, or laying down. Counting down from 5, use your senses to list things around you. Make an effort to notice details about these things. This is how to do it. Start by breathing deeply in through your nose and out through your mouth. Then slowly look at your surroundings. Find 5 things that you can see around you. Maybe you see a colorful poster on the wall, the spider web on the bookshelf, the lamp on the nightstand with the red shade, the cat sleeping peacefully on the chair, the cactus on the dresser that has finally bloomed. Then list 4 things that you can touch. The warm mug in your hands, the soft comforter on the bed, the denim of your jeans, the scratchy carpet under your feet. Next, listen for 3 things you can hear. Maybe the ticking of a clock, the quiet hum of your computer, the sound of traffic from outside. Now try to find 2 things that you can smell. The tea in your mug, the clean scent of your clothes. Finally, list 1 emotion that you feel. This is a way to ground yourself so you can feel present in the moment and in control of your surroundings.
They take us through that exercise, but we're going to skip that part. But again, there's a ton of grounding things. Something to think about is, if we're doing a longer retreat, do we do a couple of grounding exercises at the beginning? Just something to think about. Trelevan talks about to keeping the body and mind, addressing disassociation. Talks about the fear mobility cycle, or the Medusa piece. And remember, Medusa The person who looked in the eyes of Medusa turned to stone. And the same thing can happen to a person who's experienced trauma when they sit in the quiet. If that trauma comes and they're like just stuck with that trauma, it freezes them and they put themselves in a disassociative state. And the problem is it's difficult to recognize what's a deep meditation and what's disassociating, right? Well, let me tell you a story about Brooke. And this was a person who lost an infant and was struggling with that. Obviously, she had some trauma symptoms following that, but was doing a little bit better, and her and her husband were even talking about maybe having another child. It was her first child, and meditation had been a helpful piece for her. And there was this weekend retreat coming up, and she talked to her husband, and they both decided it'd be good for her. She gets on the retreat, and she's getting credit for doing a really great job of sitting in quiet. But inside, she's feeling really dysregulated um, and off. And she talked to one of the leaders, and they said, just notice when it changes. So she stayed with it and got to the evening, and she couldn't sleep, and she just wanted to be with her husband and get a hug, but he wasn't there. And she's in this retreat where she really didn't know anybody, and they're in silence. And so she's hugging herself, thinking about being hugged by her husband and just crying. And finally, she packs up and leaves a note saying that she had the flu because she was embarrassed, and went home. And once she got home, she really, everything's really fell apart. She had more of a dysregulated arousal thing where at some point she was like, couldn't get out of bed and couldn't hardly move. And at another point she was going 100 miles an hour. Anytime she heard an ambulance, she was back in her mind at the bedside of her dead infant. And she worked as a nurse in a ward. And so work became impossible for her. So just some things to think about. How do we realize when somebody may be disassociating versus in deep meditation? And so things you would pay attention to are things like somebody who normally is pretty conversive, all of a sudden they can't put words together. Somebody who's feeling like they can't sleep, that they're feeling kind of off, and they're talking about that. Well, pay attention to that and maybe ask them a few questions about that. And again, we talked about using the senses as grounding, be cautious with body scans. One of the things I always do, actually, I'm going to be doing some work with 4th and 5th graders this week and with anxiety, and I'm going to have them breathe through the anxiety in their body. And I'll remind them before we do that exercise that sometimes that can bring about uncomfortable feelings, and remind them of the grounding things we practiced at the beginning of the year. And he talks about leaving people in choice. I think about agency. So if somebody is experiencing trauma, how do we let them help figure out what's going to happen? It shouldn't be, well, you need to leave this retreat or you should stay at this retreat. It should be more of a mutual, what do you think should happen? And explore that with them. Because that leaves them because if I'm telling them what to do and they do it, well, fine. But if they choose to do it and it works and helps them to be better, well, then they're part of getting better. Incorporate movement into practice. Before I sit today, I was going to do some yoga, but for time, I cut that out. But how do we do that? I know often we'll sit and walk and sit. But how do we, if we're doing a longer retreat, maybe we need to make sure there's some yoga or some Tai Chi or something in there. They talk about being flexible with posture. When I'm working with when I was working with some confirmation students a few years ago, I gave them a choice. You can sit in your chair, you can lay on the floor, you can sit with your feet up the wall. Anything that's gonna, so how to be flexible with some of those things. Respecting physical boundaries. I was in a yoga class once where I loved it because the teacher mostly did poses I could do, and I could hear her because my hearing isn't the best anymore. But when it came to the Shavasana, the last one, the corpse pose, she came around and was pushed down on my shoulders, and I was okay with that. But I thought, wow, she didn't ask to do that, and that could be really traumatic for somebody. Anything we can do to create a safe space. How do we structure the sit and let people know what's going to actually happen each moment of the way? That'll help, right? Think about a sensory environment. Certain scents might triggers somebody. Having gender neutral bathrooms will help our GLBTQ individuals feel more comfortable. Now, if your congregation or church isn't safe for GLBTQ, please don't have gender free bathrooms, or gender neutral bathrooms. So just some things to think about. And then he talks about practice and relationship. So trauma recovery, really, trauma happens, as we talked about how when it's a trauma by somebody that affects us more, trauma recovery takes place only in the context of relationship. I think of my story where I was with the turkey, where I had people to talk to about it. That helped me out. Brooke's story, where she was there without her husband, she needed a hug from her husband at that point. The author in Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness talks about going on a Buddhist retreat, and the first night, the woman in the room next to him wept the whole night through, and in the morning she was asking in their group thing about her situation, and she says, I just came from another country where there was this horrible catastrophe and a lot of people died, and I just can't get those sights out of my head. And the person leading the retreat, to the surprise of Trelevan, says, well, maybe you need to just go home right now and be with your family and heal and come back when you're at a different spot. We know that being with others who are calm helps us to calm. Most of the time, being with those we love is calming. One of my most calming things is going for a walk with my wife, so that's where I think being in a relationship really helps. And then Trelevan talks about normalizing somebody's experience when they're experiencing trauma during a sit or during a meditation, and break that down to, I want to say more than that. I think we need to empathize with their situation. We need to normalize that it's not unusual, and we need to explore what the person wants to do, how to, let them be in charge. So that might look like something like, and it's hard for me to do this empathetically when I'm talking to a computer screen. So I apologize if don't sound very empathetic here, but maybe something like, wow, I'm really sorry that's happening to you right now. I can't imagine losing a child, or being harassed by people, or being robbed. And it's not unusual, given that just happened, that when you sit in quiet, that those thoughts might come up. And, we can talk about some grounding things. We can do some other things, but what do you think is going to help you the most here? We got another day left of this retreat, or we got another 8 days left in the retreat. What do you think is going to be most helpful? And then doing some exploring about what else to do with that. And then I think about, so when do you suggest a spiritual director? When do you suggest a therapist? And I think about, if somebody's actually reliving, having flashbacks during a sit, I think that's a time to, for sure, think about a therapist, or at least have that suggestion. Again, the person needs to take that step themselves. But if they're also talking about having anxiety or depression that's getting in the way of their functioning, of their relationships, of their work, of the things they want to, their normal living, of their sleeping, of their eating, that's a good thing to check in with a therapist. And I think of a spiritual director, and I'm not a spiritual director, so people can correct me here if I'm missing it, but I think when you're trying to figure out, where is God calling me? When you're dealing with a dark night experience, those kind of things, a spiritual director can be really helpful. I think after my dad died, I think it would have been really nice if I had a spiritual director. So just some things to think about. And then I think about, when we do a centering prayer retreat where people are away from their support systems and in silence, how do we manage this so we're less likely to precipitate or re-traumatization? So just some things to think about. And then kind of wrapping up here, I wanted to say a few of the things I do to lessen re-traumatization when I'm working with school children. I always let them know the first session. I always talk about, and even if I worked with the group last year, I'm going to let them know again, because I think it's a good reminder. But the first session, I always talk about how scary memories can pop up when you quiet your mind in a meditation, just like they do when our mind calms before we go to sleep. And last year when I did that with the 1 second grade classroom, one of the students yelled out, "That happens to me every night. That's why I can't sleep ever." And he had a special ed support person. So I talked to the special ed teacher, talked to the therapist. They both agreed that he should be in the sessions, but needed support. And so often he would take a walk with the therapist or with his support person when we got to the meditation part. but they thought he should be there for the lesson. I always ask students to tell me or their teacher if they're experiencing scary memories. I just want to be aware of that. So let them know we can do things differently. I did have one student when I was working with some lower cognitive students, where I had a screen up that showed, I think it was an ocean, and he kind of freaked out. And so something for him that just didn't work. And so I didn't show any more ocean scenes, or I kind of avoided the water because for some reason that was scary for him. And then I'll always the first session, I teach some grounding exercises and some breathing exercises, that things that people can do. Like I said, in my centering prayer group, we have a candle that people can come to and open their eyes if they feel like they're overwhelmed. Uh, and then with the kids, I always have quiet music and nature scenes on the smartboard, so they can look at that if they need to. It also helps because if somebody's making some noises, then it makes it easier for the rest of them to sit in quiet. And I have a similar format each week. And it's interesting. It seems like 3 is a magic number. When I go by the third week, I go in a row, students can really enter into the quiet, into the meditation. And I think part of that's because they know I'm going to start out with a listening bowl or a chime. We're going to do some breathing techniques. There's going to be some kind of presentation. We're going to do some yoga or some other movement. And then we're going to end with some type of meditation. And usually it's more of where I'm talking them through a meditation of some kind. But because I think having that same format each time, that makes it safer. And I only offer lessons when the primary teacher's in the room. I've been asked to do it when there's a sub, and that's just where I'm asking them to do something that doesn't always feel safe. And I just won't do it without the teacher there. I did make an exception last year where there was a long-term sub for pregnancy leave. But I said I needed support. And so the school social worker, the special ed teacher, and sometimes the assistant principal were in there. And it worked okay. But I needed that extra support for the students who were struggling in that room because it just increased the safety. So we were going to do a final small group. And what I want you to do in the small group is to share one thing you'll do to care for yourself today. You've heard about some traumas, and so I think it's important to talk about that. Discuss one way you might use this information. Discuss what's most important to say or do if somebody shares that they're reliving an intensive trauma during a sit, and what additional information might we need. We'll also be sending out an evaluation that will have some of this information in, but I'd like to move to that next small group. So just a couple of things as people are coming back. There is a survey that Rainey's putting in the chat that kind of goes over some of there's a couple of yes, no questions if I met my learning goals, but then also a few questions about what next steps can we take as individuals and as contemplative outreach to continue to be more trauma sensitive. And so we've got 10 minutes left. I'm open to any questions that people have. Maybe, I don't know if you want to do them in the chat or what's the best way to do that. See Catherine there. What's your question, Catherine?
Talking about someone in the group brought up the idea that letting go that happens in centering prayer can be a way, in some ways, of bypassing dealing with feelings and things like that. And I have heard that before, and I've thought about it, but I never really delved deeply into it. But I'm wondering if the practice of centering prayer and the letting go piece, which I feel like I've gotten pretty good at, is also a way of letting go of and not dealing with maybe some trauma things, like feelings about certain things. And how would I even know that? I don't know. So that's my question.
No, I think that's anytime, whether it's anger, whether it's anxiety, whether it's trauma, anytime we can kind of separate ourselves a little bit and almost have it be like a different entity and be curious about our anger, be curious about our anxiety. Where are we feeling that? That helps us to deal with it differently. So that's perfect. And that's really what, who was I'm losing his name right now, but the gentleman who worked with groups of people in trauma, he talked about most of the time we can notice it and then let it go and not have it overwhelm us. Sometimes, though, the trauma is so intense, or for whatever reason, that it's so overwhelming that the people aren't able to do that. And that's where doing a grounding practice, or if it's too much, maybe seeing a therapist or talking to a spiritual director could be helpful. And what I was talking about in my small group is sometimes I think people come to things like prior meditation or centering prayer and have a trauma experience and they never come back. And so how do we let them know initially that can happen, so that if it does happen, they'll talk to us, and so we can help them work through that, so it can be a part of their healing rather than something, one more thing that they're avoiding.
So what would you say, Greg, at the beginning of a group specifically to make them aware?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in our centering prayer group, we have a candle there, and I've kind of said, if somebody's having a hard time, it's okay to, or have a coughing fit, it's okay to open your eyes, look at the candle. It's okay to walk out of the room and take a break. I know, I think when we're doing introduction to centering prayer sessions, I wonder about including a grounding exercise, or at least talking that is a possibility. And please talk to one of the leaders if that's happening to you. That it's not, it's not unheard of that it happens. Knowing that most people don't have that much. Most people who have traumatic experience happening to them don't develop a PTSD or significant trauma response. With the Red Cross, most people with house fires, right? They don't need to see a mental health therapist. They're going to do okay. It's going to be rough for a few weeks till they figure out where they're living, what's happening, but they're going to do okay. But some people are going to need more support. And so how do we do that in a way that, yeah, and I don't know that's a specific thing to say, but I think, how do you, with the kids, I let them know the first session, some of this can happen, and let me know if it happens for you so we can work with you to do something different.
Thank you.
And then I see Bob's hand up.
Thank you. It occurred to me in the last couple of years, I was listening to a YouTube video by Tara Brach, the Buddhist teacher and psychologist, and she said that in the old days, if people had a trauma, there was a big emphasis to make people face it. You got to face it to get through it, and how over time now there's a developing sensitivity to that trauma, just like you're talking about. That it's no longer just this boom, you got to face it, but gradually make things manageable so that people can integrate it into their thinking and life. So.
I totally hear what you're saying, Bob. I worked with a psychiatrist once who was Jewish, and he said that some people dealt with the Holocaust by talking about it. Some people dealt with living through the Holocaust by never talking about it. It's not like one or the other. We're all different. So what does each person need? I know when I was working as a baby therapist, when I was first as a therapist, I'd go right to the pain. And if it was a trauma experience, a lot of times the people didn't come back. And then I realized I need to talk around. At the first session, you don't go right to the trauma. You talk about what things are helping them and give them some strategies. And then when they come back the second time, then you talk about how was that to talk a little bit around your trauma and what strategies are working for you. And matter of fact, sometimes you never even actually talk about the trauma, and people can get better. So it's not one or the other. It's each person's individual and what's that individual need.
Well, it's interesting because kind of having to face it, I think that's something that's come up in the last decade or two, being very abrupt. But if we go back to the origins of psychotherapy, that's just what Freud said. He said you've got to make it, you can't just lay it on the patient. You have to make it tolerable for them in a way that they can gradually be exposed to the thing that's underneath.
Yep. And when you're dealing with anxiety, a lot of times it's not about, people will try to avoid anything that's anxious producing. Well, pretty soon you're avoiding everything. That doesn't work. So how do you figure out what are the things that you can gradually deal with that are anxiety producing and get more comfortable with it? And so you can gradually, so your life doesn't get too small. And the same, I think, can happen with the, in centering prayer with the unloading of the unconscious. Isn't that just all their past stuff that gets us to live our false self? And
I think Father Thomas.
once we're working through some of those things, then maybe we can be more true selves.
I think Father Thomas um, said that the centering prayer method, as he developed it, makes a gradual exposure possible. So,
Yep. And I would say with dealing with anxiety, that's just most times what you want to do.
yeah. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah. And the same psychiatrist used to say, when you deal with anxiety, if somebody's scared of snakes, two ways you can get rid of it. You can throw them in a snake pit and they either die of fright or they learn to live with the snakes. or you gradually, have them think about a snake and then get a snake a little closer and then look at a snake from a long distance. And, you know, and I like the gradual approach rather than the snake pit.
If you have a pulled muscle, it's an analogy. You want to exercise it, you want to stretch it a little bit, but you don't want to abuse it. And every pulled muscle is a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly. And for some people, their trauma is such that for whatever reason, when they meditate, they get into that Medusa piece where they're facing that trauma and they get frozen there. And then all the trauma symptoms get worse for them. And so how do we help those people to heal? And the first part of that is taking the shame away from that and letting them talk to us about it so we can direct them to where they need to go. And I don't think we all need to be therapists, but we maybe need to be aware when somebody could be helped by a therapist or by a spiritual director. Well, I'm realizing we're at 3:30, and I'm wondering, John, if I could press upon you to close us with a prayer since you started us out with one.
Thank you so much, Greg. We all greatly appreciate this opportunity to kind of reflect together, to learn together, and for what you've provided for us, some instruction and ways. And I do want to encourage you to fill out the survey form. That if you can just click open that small piece that put in the chat, you could get to it right away. Better if you did it right afterwards. That would be helpful to us in planning for future events like this. And also that we have recorded this, so we're hoping that we'll be able to put it up online if you want to know some of the resources and things that look back over parts of it. But thank you all for being here. We do want to honor the time, so let's just end. I'm going to give the words of the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and grant you peace. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Have a blessed day, and thank you for being here.